comprises not only British air crews, but also air crews from the British Empire, including dominions like Canada. There was a very substantial Canadian presence inside the ranks of RAF Bomber Command throughout much of the war. And there are various reasons for that presence, which I won't get into right now. But it's probably fair to say that on average, in every RAF bomber crew, you could probably find at least one Canadian. At least one Canadian. So this was very much an aspect of the war in which Canadians were heavily involved, and the Canadian pilots and crew members were impossibly young, really typically no older than university undergraduate students are today. So anyways, to look at the experience just of RAF Bomber Command and put aside for a moment the U.S. Army Air Force, throughout the war, RAF Bomber Command flew something like 365,000 sorties. A sortie is one aircraft taking off for a mission, so about 365,000 sorties, which meant that they dropped about 1 million tons of bombs over Germany and or German-occupied Europe. You may say, "Wow, this is an incredible feat that there was so much bombing activity and such a massive weight of ordnance was dropped over German and associated targets." But this effort came at an exceptionally high cost, because aircrew fatality rates, I'm not talking about casualty rates, I'm talking about fatality rates, putting aside aircrew members who were injured but not killed. Aircrew fatality rates in RAF Bomber Command reached 45%. Right? So nearly 1 in every 2 of the men who served in RAF Bomber Command, and we're only talking about men here, nearly 1 in every 2 was killed. It is very difficult in the entire experience of either world war, to find any other trade, military trade, or branch of service in which fatality rates approach 50%. The only example that I can think of would be the German submarine service in the Second World War, where fatality rates among submarine crew members surpassed 50%. So this was an extremely dangerous branch of service in which to be operating. And the irony, of course, is that during the interwar period, writers and theorists like Julio Duhay imagined that a bombing strategy would avoid heavy casualties, such as had been witnessed among the armies on the battlefields of the First World War. But this did not, in fact, prove to be the case. In fact, casualties amongst bomber crews were fatal casualties were very high, and it's not hard to understand why. Let's admit that when a bomber is hit either by anti-aircraft fire or by cannon fire from enemy fighters, or has some kind of mechanical malfunction, and there's a crash, the chances of survival are very slim. The chances of survival are very slim. And to put the matter into a Canadian context for a minute, about 8,200 Canadians were killed while serving in RAF Bomber Command, and this accounts for roughly 1 in 5 of the Canadians who were killed in the entire Second World War. About 1 in 5 Canadians who were killed in the Second World War were killed while serving in bomber crews. And I'm not even getting in. I'm talking here about the human cost for the Allies, for the RAF at least. But we're not even getting into the cost in aircraft. These airplanes were the cutting edge machines of their day. They were very expensive to build. They required the input of valuable strategic materials, vast quantities of aluminum, significant quantities of rubber, and other scarce strategic materials. This was expensive. If these materials had not been used to build bomber aircraft, they could have been used for other military purposes. Right? So these costs also have to be taken into account. And then you also have the training costs involved in training crew members. And again, because this was a highly technical trade, the costs of training were fairly high. Training bomber crew members could not simply be done in a matter of a few weeks. It took time. We can also look at the cost, the human cost on the ground, because we're fairly confident, historians of the bombing campaign are fairly confident, that at least 600,000 German and European civilians were killed by Allied bombs during the course of the Strategic Air War. And most of these casualties were Germans. Invariably, when attacks were made over targets outside of Germany, civilians of other nationalities, including Allied nationalities, were also killed. And this is a pretty substantial human cost to a military strategy whose ostensible aim was to shorten the war and minimize casualties in the process. And we also have to accept or grapple with the reality that among these 600,000 fatalities on the ground, civilian fatalities, approximately 1 in 5 were children under the age of 16 years. So that's 20% of 600,000. And this isn't something that we usually talk about or that we like to talk about, but let's admit that whatever we think of the ethics or morality involved in killing adult civilians in Nazi Germany, who may or may not have supported the Nazi regime, certainly we can't blame the children who happened to live in Germany at the time for the political decisions made by their parents and other grown-ups in the country. So there was an ethical cost, a human cost that one has to take into account when weighing and balancing the impact of this campaign. And there are various ways of approaching the argument. One could argue that even though 600,000 civilians were killed on the ground, including 150,000 children under the age of 16 years old, that in fact, in the end, lives were saved because the war was shortened due to the impact that the bombing campaign had on the German war economy. And that is an argument that could be pursued. That in net terms, more lives were saved than were lost. And one, of course, can take various other approaches. So what impact did the campaign have on Germany's warfighting capacity? Well, undoubtedly, it placed an enormous strain on German defenses, particularly from 1943 forward, when the Germans were increasingly hard-pressed in their campaigns on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, also their campaign in the Italian theater, which we haven't discussed yet, as well as the other efforts that they were undertaking, including the war at sea and so forth. So what the bombing campaign forced the Germans to do was to bring lots of artillery back to the home front, where it could be used in an anti-aircraft role, rather than directly on the battlefield against enemy armies. And it also compelled the Germans to bring more and more of their fighter squadrons back to Germany, so that they could act in a defensive role against the bomber formations. This posed a huge opportunity cost for the German forces. Furthermore, although strategic bombing, at least up until the last months of the war, never really permanently shut down German manufacturing capacities, it certainly created huge sources of friction in the German war manufacturing industry, because there were constant interruptions to production due to the bomb damage in factories, due to the bomb damage of transportation infrastructure, which caused, and I think I'm going to borrow here a contemporary term, supply chain problems, as well as the fact that many German factory workers who were living in larger towns and cities, because they were constantly being raided and having to get out of bed and go into the air raid shelters and losing sleep, they probably weren't working at their peak efficiency. and that would also have an impact on sort of quality control of manufacturing output. It's absolutely true that the bombing campaign had a far-reaching impact on German war manufacturing. The difficulty is that we don't know how the situation would have looked if there had not been such a heavy bombing campaign. We don't know how much more output would have been produced in Germany in the absence of strategic bombing. So it's difficult to quantify exactly what the impact was on the German war economy. Now, when we're talking about opportunity cost, naturally, we have to also consider the opportunity cost that the Allies incurred in waging this campaign. And I think I've already touched on these. The cost of training crews who could have been serving in other military capacities. The aircraft that were manufactured could have been used for other purposes, which would have been strategically or operationally useful. Or the raw materials and manufacturing capacity could have been put into some other types of weapons. Right? There are all kinds of possibilities. And all of this means that the final impact of the bombing campaign is very difficult to quantify. And this is why it continues to be a source of debate, both among historians and even among even within the popular arena more generally, right up until the present time. There is still lots of literature that has been produced in recent years that argues both sides of this equation. That the bombing campaign was either worthwhile and ethically defensible, or that it wasn't worthwhile and was not ethically defensible. So I'm just going to have to leave it up to students to make their own judgments, based on the evidence that we've taken into account, both in the lecture here and also in the course readings. Turning to submarine warfare, we deal again with a topic that is of far-reaching strategic consequence in each conflict, but one where technology is also naturally an important theme, because whether we're talking about bomber aircraft or ocean-going submarines in the world wars, this really represented the cutting-edge technology of those conflicts, and also these were some of the most expensive weapons of those conflicts. So we're going to take a more directly comparative approach to submarine warfare in the two world wars, because there are lots of similarities, but also some key differences. But once again, I encourage students to look carefully at the relevant sections from each textbook in conjunction with this lecture. We'll begin by surveying British and German naval strategies at the outbreak of the First World War up until early 1915, or mid-1915. And by way of context, remember that in the world of 1914, the British Royal Navy is the premier navy on the planet. Nobody has a more powerful and strategically significant navy in 1914 than Britain does. And some have said that the Royal Navy at that point in time, and even in the late 19th century, if you will, was probably one of the most formidable instruments of strategy and foreign policy that ever existed in the world in recorded history. This is how significant the Royal Navy was in strategic terms. The German Navy, the Imperial German Navy, by contrast, was a relatively young service, because after all, Imperial Germany was only created in 1871, and it wasn't until later that the Emperor Wilhelm II began to build up a navy. So the Imperial German Navy, also known as the High Seas Fleet, was a young force, and although it was highly technologically sophisticated and very expensive to build, it was not the equal of the Royal Navy during the First